Usually when we talk about medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of clinical precision. It feels almost like engineering,
Really?
right?
Absolutely.
Like if you break your arm, you go to the hospital, they take an X-ray, and it shows that jagged white line on the black film.
Right, right.
The doctor just points to it and says, there it is.
It's binary. The bone is broken, or it isn't broken. I mean, it's clean, it's verifiable, and frankly, it's deeply comforting. We humans really like things to be visible and easily categorized.
Yeah, we really do. But then, you step out of the hospital and you step into the world of modern cultural dynamics.
Yeah.
You step into sociology or human resources or just the language we use every single day.
And it gets messy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Suddenly, that X-ray machine is just completely broken. We're looking at a diagnostic landscape that is, well, it's murky, it's highly subjective, and it's incredibly charged.
Yeah, there's no consensus anymore.
Right. We no longer have a consensus on what constitutes a fracture, which is exactly why we're jumping into this specific topic today. So, welcome to the deep dive. I am thrilled you are here with us.
It's a really complex landscape to navigate, and doing so requires taking a hard look at some very polarizing blueprints.
It does. And today, we have, honestly, one of the most polarizing blueprints available right now. We are opening up a brand new, highly controversial ebook that was published this year, 2026.
Yeah, this one is making some serious waves.
Huge waves. It is titled Offense is Taken, Not Given, a Thomistic Takedown of Microaggression Theory and Thought Crime. And it's by Conrad Riker.
That is quite the title.
Right. And the book itself is a fiery surgical deconstruction of modern culture. It's specifically aimed at men navigating the modern culture wars, particularly those within the men's rights or the manosphere communities.
Yeah, he is writing directly to them.
Exactly. Riker is providing them with this rigid, classical framework to understand the history of our institutions before they were, well, in his view, completely captured by feminist and Marxist ideologies.
I mean, it's an incredibly dense, unapologetic text. It really does not pull its punches.
Not even slightly. And for you listening, before we crack open this incredibly controversial book, please take a second right now to like and subscribe to the show.
It really helps.
It does. It tells the algorithms that this kind of thorough, unflinching analysis actually matters, and it helps us keep bringing these deep dives directly to you. Also, if you want to read this provocative text for yourself, and we always recommend going directly to the primary sources to verify what you hear, you can buy the ebook on Amazon Kindle and Google Playbooks.
You definitely should read the source material.
Yep, Amazon Kindle and Google Playbooks. And you should also follow the author for his ongoing commentary on Substack at Conrad and Riker.
Now, before we go a single step further, I need to establish a very clear framework for how we are operating today.
Yeah, this is super important.
It really is. This is crucial for you, our listener, to understand right off the bat. The text we are analyzing contains some highly charged political, social, and cultural arguments. I mean, it touches on feminism, Marxism, gender identity, and the foundations of the modern manosphere.
It's minefield.
It is. So I want to make it explicitly clear that we are not taking sides today. We are not endorsing Conrad Riker's viewpoints, nor are we condemning them.
We're entirely neutral here.
Strictly analytical. Our mission today is strictly analytical. We are here to impartially report on the content provided in the book, to unpack Riker's philosophical frameworks, and to help you understand the precise mechanics of his arguments exactly as they exist in the original source material.
Basically, we are looking at the architectural blueprints of his argument. We are not telling you whether or not you should actually build a house.
Right, exactly. So, setting the stage. The core premise of Riker's book rests on the assertion that modern Western institutions, and we are talking about universities, Fortune 500 corporations, HR departments, the mainstream media, that they have been entirely captured.
Yeah, institutional capture is his big theme.
Right. He argues they've been taken over by ideological movements that deliberately weaponized language. And they did this to pathologize traditional masculinity and ultimately to dismantle objective reality itself.
And if we want to understand how Riker claims an entire society's institutions were captured, we kind of have to start where he starts.
With the words.
Yes. We have to look at how he says the human mind and the English language were compromised. He goes straight to the foundation of all communication, which is the definition of words. Specifically, he focuses on the word offense.
I found this part fascinating. He goes all the way back to the Latin etymology, which is A really grounding way to start such a massive critique. It's a very classical rhetorical move, right? He points out that the word offense derives from the Latin verb offendere, which literally translates to strike against, to stumble, or to collide.
So it's totally physical.
Exactly. Historically, its absolute earliest sense was entirely physical and concrete. Riker uses this really vivid image. He says, imagine a man walking down a road and striking his foot against a large stone.
Okay, ouch.
Right. But his point is, the stone didn't have intent. It didn't choose to wound the man. It simply existed in the physical realm. And the collision between the foot and the stone produced an objective injury.
Okay, so over centuries, obviously that word drifted from the strictly physical realm into the moral and legal realm.
Right, yeah.
Like you started having offenses against the crown or offenses against the law. But Riker's critical point here is that in every single historical usage, an offense described an objective act.
A measurable thing.
Yes, a measurable transgression against a known standard. The offense was always located in the act itself, not in the feelings of the person observing the act.
Which brings us to his primary diagnosis of our current era. Riker argues that the modern grievance industry, and that's a term he uses a lot, to describe this vast apparatus of diversity consultants, HR departments, and university equity officers, he says they have fundamentally translocated the concept of offense.
They moved it.
They surgically removed it from the objective act of the speaker and implanted it entirely into the subjective reception of the listener.
Okay, wow. So he argues that a microaggression is now defined simply as whatever the aggrieved party says it is.
Exactly.
The speaker's intent. Totally irrelevant. The objective reality or the dictionary definition of the words they spoke. Irrelevant.
Yeah, the only thing that holds any epistemic authority in a modern HR department is the subjective emotional feeling of the listener.
He uses very strong philosophical language to condemn this shift, right?
Yeah.
He calls microaggression theory epistemologically void.
He does. And to clarify, for anyone who might be rusty on their philosophy, epistemology is the study of how we know what we know.
It's the framework of truth.
Exactly. So Riker argues that because microaggression theory relies entirely on the internal, unprovable feeling of the accuser, it basically functions as a closed system of allegation.
Meaning there is no way out.
Right. There is no internal mechanism for exoneration.
He says the theory is unfalsifiable. Now that's a concept he borrows heavily from Karl Popper's philosophy of science, right? How does that mechanic actually work in practice?
So Karl Popper was a philosopher who established a core tenet of the scientific method. Basically, for a theory to be scientifically valid, there must be a theoretical way to prove it false.
Okay, like a test.
Right. The classic example is swans. If I propose the theory that all swans are white, that is a valid scientific theory because it is falsifiable.
You can falsify it simply by finding one black swan.
You got it. But Riker argues microaggression theory is unfalsifiable by design. There is no black swan you can present to prove your innocence.
Because it's all based on feelings.
Yes. If someone accuses you of a microaggression and you agree with them, well, you admit your guilt. But if you disagree with them and you attempt to defend yourself, your very disagreement is cited by the HR department as proof of your white fragility or your unconscious bias.
Oh man, so your defense actually becomes the new evidence of your guilt.
It's a complete psychological trap. He compares it directly to the Inquisition. An accusation equals guilt, and the only path forward is a full, groveling confession to the tribunal.
But Riker doesn't just stick to philosophy here, which is interesting. He actually brings physics, literal physics, into the argument to debunk the modern mantra that words are violence.
Yes. The alchemy of violence.
The alchemy of violence. That analogy is quite striking. I mean, alchemy historically was that medieval pseudoscience where people tried to transmute base metals or even just thin air into gold.
Right, magic, basically.
Yeah. So Riker argues that modern sociologists are attempting an epistemological alchemy. They're trying to transmute the invisible air of spoken words into the concrete atrocity of physical violence.
And he lays out a strict formal syllogism to prove this. Let's walk through the mechanics of it, because this is really the absolute core of his defense against what he calls thought crime.
Okay, lay it out for us.
Major premise. Objective harm, like a bruise, a laceration, or a fractured skull, necessitates physical displacement. It requires a measurable transfer of kinetic energy.
Makes sense. Physics 101.
Minor premise. Speech, which is just acoustic sound waves vibrating through the air, and written words, which are just symbolic visual representations on a screen, possess absolute zero physical mass.
Right.
They entirely lack the kinetic energy required to cause any objective physical displacement.
Okay, so following the rules of classical logic, we arrive at his conclusion. Because words lack mass and kinetic energy, they cannot constitute objective physical harm.
Exactly. To equate speech with physical violence is to violate the fundamental laws of physics. Riker insists that a bruise requires mass and velocity, and a syllable has neither.
So therefore, the phrase words are violence is an epistemological lie designed to manipulate the justice system.
That is his exact argument.
Okay, wait, hold on. I need to play devil's advocate here and test this framework, because Riker spends this entire section drawing a massive, impenetrable wall between physical kinetic energy and language.
He really does.
But if we follow his strict logic that only physical kinetic energy constitutes harm, how does he account for the undeniable, mathematically measurable psychological impact of something like prolonged isolation, gaslighting, or intense verbal conditioning?
That's the big question.
Right, because we know from modern neuroscience that persistent verbal abuse can literally alter cortisol levels and brain chemistry. Does his strict reliance on kinetic physics just exclude emotional impact from the realm of justice entirely?
That is a very sharp critique, and it requires us to unpack the specific philosophical tradition Riker is operating within. He describes his takedown as Thomistic.
Thomas Aquinas, right?
Yes, meaning he relies heavily on the philosophy of Thomas Aquinas as well as Aristotle. To put it simply, in that classical framework, human laws are only supposed to police what you do with your hands, not what you feel in your heart.
The state regulates the physical realm. The spiritual or emotional realm is left to God or to the individual's conscience. So he isn't saying that verbal cruelty doesn't hurt. He's saying it's not the government's job to regulate it.
Precisely. Riker would argue that while verbal cruelty is absolutely a moral failing, treating it as a legal or institutional crime equivalent to physical violence gives the state terrifying, unlimited power over human communication.
Because then the state decides what hurts.
Yes. He essentially argues that the risk of a soft totalitarianism policing our daily speech is a far greater threat to the survival of civilization than the hurt feelings of an individual.
He forces a really hard classical binary here. Either we strictly police physical actions or we police subjective feelings. And historically, policing feelings always ends in tyranny.
And he claims we forgot this distinction entirely because of the collapse of our educational foundations. He specifically points to the loss of the Trivium.
Yes, the Trivium. For centuries, that was the threefold shield of Western cognition, right? It was the foundational model of classical education.
It was. It consisted of grammar, logic, and rhetoric.
So grammar gives you the structure of language and precise, immutable definitions.
Yeah.
Logic gives you the rules of thought, ensuring your conclusions actually follow from your premises.
Yep.
And rhetoric gives you the art of persuasion, using grammar and logic to move the listener toward objective truth.
But Riker argues that what he calls the feminization of the academy, and that's a phrase he uses to describe the shift from empirical, rigorous debate to emotional coddling. He says it systematically dismantled that threefold shield.
How so?
Well, he says grammar, the bedrock of definitions, was replaced by critical deconstruction. You know, the postmodern idea that words don't have stable meanings at all.
Okay, yeah.
Logic was replaced by critical theory, which he says just criticizes existing structures but builds absolutely nothing in their place.
And rhetoric.
Rhetoric was replaced by emotional manipulation.
Wow. And the ultimate symbol of that emotional manipulation for Riker is the university trigger warning.
Oh, he hates trigger warnings.
He does. He explicitly says it replaces the classical educational goal of forging a robust, resilient mind with the modern therapeutic goal of protecting a fragile one from any conceptual friction.
That is exactly it.
So if society has completely altered the dictionary to change how we view violence in education, it is only logical they would target the actual biology of the speaker next.
Yes, this is a natural progression for his argument.
Which brings us to Riker's aggressive stance on the blank slate theory and how modern institutions treat human nature.
To really wrap your head around his argument here, we have to deeply examine his deconstruction of the blank slate.
Okay, let's unpack that.
So the blank slate is the sociological premise that human beings are born without any innate biological predispositions. It argues that gender is entirely a cultural construct.
Basically saying we are just hard drives with nothing on them when we're born.
Exactly. In this view, society simply programs us to act male or female through expectations, toys, and media.
Riker attacks this theory relentlessly. And he doesn't just use abstract philosophy, he points to what he sees as the horrific real-world consequences of taking the blank slate theory to its logical extreme.
He spends a significant amount of time unpacking the tragic case of David Reimer as his primary exhibit.
Yeah, the mechanics of the David Reimer case are essential to Riker's point. For you listeners who might not be familiar, this is one of the most controversial and heartbreaking cases in the history of psychiatry, taking place back in the late 1960s.
It really is a dark chapter.
So David was born a perfectly healthy biological male. However, a botched circumcision procedure as an infant severely damaged his anatomy. His parents were desperate, and they sought the help of a prominent psychologist at Johns Hopkins named Dr. John Money.
And John Money was a massive proponent of the blank slate theory regarding gender.
He was like one of his chief architects, right?
He was. Dr. Money convinced David's parents to take a radical step. He told them to surgically alter the infant and raise him entirely as a girl. They named him Brenda.
Because Money hypothesized that gender identity was entirely learned.
Yes. He believed that if they simply dressed Brenda in dresses, gave her dolls, and socialized her exclusively as a female, the biological hardware would be completely overwritten by the social software.
But the experiment was a catastrophic failure.
Total failure.
Riker details how David, despite being socialized entirely as a girl from infancy, just instinctively rejected the programming. He tore off the dresses. He exhibited typical male rough-and-tumble play.
He suffered severe psychological trauma and alienation from a very young age.
Eventually, in his early teens, his parents finally confessed the truth to him, and David immediately transitioned back to living as a male. But the years of psychological manipulation took a horrific toll, and he tragically ended his own life as an adult.
It's awful. Riker uses the mechanics of this tragedy to argue an absolute biological rule. Hardware is immutable.
You cannot socially engineer away millions of years of evolutionary DNA.
Right. He argues that Dr. Money's hubris was thinking he could play God with a sociological theory, and the result was the destruction of human life.
And Riker connects this historical tragedy directly to modern clinical debates. He specifically cites the 2018 study by researcher Lisa Lippman, which was published in the peer-reviewed journal PLOS1.
Yes, the ROGD study.
Right. This study focused on a phenomenon Lippman termed rapid onset gender dysphoria, or ROGD.
Lippman's research methodology involved surveying parents of adolescents who had suddenly, without any prior childhood history of gender nonconformity, declared they were experiencing gender dysphoria.
Out of nowhere, basically.
Exactly. And the defining mechanic of her finding was the cluster effect. The dysphoria was appearing suddenly within specific friend groups, heavily correlated with increased internet usage and peer influence.
And Riker just seizes on this data. He uses it to argue that much of modern gender distress among youth isn't an organic biological reality, but what he calls a sociological contagion.
Yeah, a contagion. He views the modern institutional push to completely separate gender from biological sex as a fundamental denial of physical reality.
He calls it a satanic subversion of form. I mean, those are heavy words. An epistemological lie that is actively destroying the minds of the youth by telling them their physical bodies are just customizable avatars.
And this firm grounding in biological reality leads directly into his fierce defense of masculinity. Riker asserts that the biological endowments of men, the higher testosterone levels, the larger lung capacity, the dense muscle hypertrophy, he says these drive specific evolutionary traits.
We are talking about systemic risk-taking, physical dominance, and a propensity for aggression.
Right. And here is his core thesis on this point. He claims these traits are not toxic. They are the evolutionary engines that literally build civilization.
He argues that it is this exact masculine drive to conquer the physical frontier, to impose order on chaos that resulted in the bridges we drive on, the deep-sea oil rigs that power our cities, and the defensive walls that keep society safe from external threats.
And he's claiming a massive societal hypocrisy is at play here.
How so?
Well, Riker argues that the modern state, which he repeatedly refers to as gynocentric, meaning centered on female perspectives and safety, wants to completely monopolize male utility.
Oh, like they want the benefits without the men.
Basically, the state desperately needs men to continue doing the heavy lifting. It needs men to pour the concrete, mine the lithium, maintain the high voltage power lines, and fight the wars.
But simultaneously, the cultural institutions pathologize the very men who provide that utility, labeling their natural aggression and stoicism as toxic.
Yes. Society treats men as a problematic liability while constantly harvesting their physical labor.
And this leads us to one of Riker's most provocative economic claims in the entire book. I mean, this part is wild. He completely rejects the mainstream narrative of the wage gap. Instead, he introduces a framework he calls the tax gap.
The tax gap. The mechanics of this argument require a really close look. Rager points to empirical texts and demographic data to assert that men, collectively as a demographic group, are the only net lifetime taxpayers in modern Western societies.
Let's actually walk through the math he uses to justify that, because it's a super bold claim. How does he calculate this?
So his logic works like this. Men dominate the most hazardous, physically demanding, and highest yielding economic sectors. We're talking construction, engineering, resource extraction.
The dangerous jobs that pay a premium.
Right. Consequently, they pay a significantly higher percentage of overall income tax. Conversely, Riker claims that women, on average over the course of their entire lives, utilize vastly more in state-funded services.
Like what kind of services?
This includes maternal health care, child care subsidies, and because women live longer on average, they draw significantly more from pension systems, Social Security, and elderly care over a longer period.
So when you balance the ledger subtracting the state services consumed from the taxes paid, Riker argues that men are a massive net positive, while women, statistically speaking, consume more than they contribute in pure tax revenue.
Therefore, Riker concludes that the modern matriarchy is entirely subsidized by the surplus labor of the very men it claims are oppressing them.
That is wow.
He introduces this concept of the state acting as a coercive institutional husband.
Institutional husband.
According to Riker, the state forcibly extracts resources from disposable working-class men via the IRS and the tax code. It then redistributes those resources to fund the independence and the welfare of women, all while actively stripping those working-class men of any societal respect or cultural authority.
Okay, hold on. Let me process this for a second, because Riker spends the whole first half of the book completely shredding the grievance industry. He tells people to stop acting like victims, to rely on objective stoicism.
He does.
But isn't this tax gap idea just men building their own grievance industry? Like, if you tell young guys they are being systemically farmed for their tax dollars by a gynocentric panopticon, aren't you just teaching them to be victims too? Doesn't this foster the exact same kind of resentment he claims to be fighting against?
That is a very sharp observation, and it really cuts to the heart of his rhetoric. Riker attempts to thread the needle here by distinguishing between subjective grievance and objective extraction.
Okay, what's the difference in his mind?
He would counter your point by arguing that the modern grievance industry relies on unfalsifiable subjective feelings of marginalization, someone looking at a painting and feeling excluded.
Right.
Whereas his tax gap is based on mathematically verifiable tax receipts, treasury data, and biological mortality rates in hazardous jobs.
So it's math versus feelings again.
Exactly. He isn't telling men to weep over their oppression. He is trying to present them with a cold, hard ledger, a balance sheet of their societal exploitation.
So his goal is to incite a rational, calculated withdrawal of their labor, rather than an emotional tantrum.
Yes, but your critique is entirely valid. The rhetorical heat he generates flirts dangerously close to creating a mirrored victimhood narrative.
Yeah, it really does. But the distinction between an emotional tantrum and a mathematical ledger is fascinating. And understanding how that ledger was supposedly rigged against men requires us to look at the historical timeline.
We have to look at the history, yeah.
Because Riker doesn't just describe this societal structure as an accident. He claims it was built deliberately as a long-term historical strategy by very specific ideological actors.
He traces the intellectual lineage of this institutional capture directly back to the Frankfurt School in the early to mid-20th century.
Okay, the Frankfurt School.
Yes, he specifically points to Marxist theorists like Herbert Marcuse and the Italian communist philosopher Antonio Gramsci.
Let's unpack the historical mechanics of that. Classical Marxism was entirely based on economics. It was purely about class warfare.
Rich versus poor.
Right. The theory was that the proletariat, the working class men sweating in the factories, would eventually realize they were being exploited and violently rise up against the bourgeoisie, the wealthy owners of those factories.
But history didn't play out that way in the West. Riker notes that the working men of the United States and Western Europe, the guys actually building the infrastructure, they never revolted.
They were too busy working.
They were busy providing for their families and enjoying the rapidly rising standard of living that capitalism, despite all its flaws, was providing them. I mean, a man who can buy a house and a car for his family doesn't generally want to burn down the state.
Makes total sense. So according to Riker, when the violent economic revolution failed to materialize, these Marxist theorists realized they needed a completely new axis for revolution.
They couldn't use class anymore.
Right. So they shifted the battleground from class to identity. If the strong, competent working men wouldn't tear down Western civilization, the academics realized they had to weaponize a different demographic.
They decided to weaponize the socially alienated.
Yes, the marginalized and the resentful, using them to dismantle the institutions from the inside.
This is exactly what Antonio Gramsci termed the long march through the institutions. The strategy wasn't to win a war with bullets, it was to slowly infiltrate the universities, the media, and the courts over decades.
And the primary target was the university system. Riker claims these theorists specifically realized they had to bypass the traditional male-coded logical faculties of the public.
Because the classical framework demanded empirical evidence and structured debate.
Exactly. So the theorists intentionally weaponized a female-coded hyper-empathetic emotionalism. If a traditionalist demanded proof of systemic rot using Aristotelian logic, they weren't met with a counter-argument.
They were met with tears.
Tears, accusations of lacking basic human empathy, and intense moral condemnation.
And this is the mechanism Riker brilliantly conceptualizes as ontological gerrymandering.
Ontological gerrymandering. I love that phrase.
It's quite a concept. Now, gerrymandering, in a political context, is when politicians manipulate the geographic boundaries of an electoral district to ensure their party always wins.
They draw the map so they can't lose.
Right. Ontological gerrymandering is far more insidious. It is manipulating the conceptual boundaries of reality itself. It is changing the very definitions of words to ensure you can never lose an argument.
It's sort of like trying to play chess with someone who keeps changing how the knight moves halfway through the game and then calls you a bigot when you point out they're breaking the rules.
That is the exact dynamic Riker is describing. He argues that traditional Western values rooted in natural law and the Trivium were incredibly resilient in open, honest debate.
So the theorists stopped attacking the arguments and started attacking the dictionary.
They systematically recoded the English language.
He lists out the redefinitions, like equity, which historically meant equal opportunity and fairness under the law, was gerrymandered to mean forced mediocrity and mandated equal outcomes.
A huge shift.
In safety, which used to mean physical preservation from kinetic harm, was gerrymandered to mean emotional coddling from opposing viewpoints.
And then hate speech?
Right. Hate speech became a sprawling catch-all term for thought crime, or honestly any dissent from the progressive narrative.
What makes this section of the book so compelling is how Riker illustrates this gerrymandering with concrete, real-world examples. He shows how empirical data is violently punished as heresy the moment it contradicts the gerrymandered narrative.
Oh, like the Roland Fryer study.
Yes. He brings up the 2016 study by Roland Fryer to prove this.
Walk us through the mechanics of the Fryer study because it's a massive piece of Riker's puzzle.
So Roland Fryer is a highly respected, award-winning black economist at Harvard University. In the mid-2010s, he and his team built an unprecedented database. They analyzed millions of police interactions, specifically focusing on data from Houston, Texas. They looked at the granular details of every single encounter.
But the data didn't cooperate with the narrative, did it?
It didn't. After exhaustive analysis, Fryer was forced to conclude that while there was racial bias in lower-level use of force, being pushed against a wall, there was absolutely no racial bias in officer-involved shootings.
Wow.
In fact, his data suggested officers were slightly less likely to fire on black suspects compared to white suspects in similar situations.
And Riker points out the reaction to this data. I mean, the academic establishment and the media didn't revise their theories based on this new, rigorous empirical data.
Not at all.
Instead, they ignored reality and sought to destroy Roland Fryer. He faced intense backlash, investigations, and attempts to discredit his career.
Riker argues this proves the capture is complete. Acknowledging empirical truth that dismantled their profitable grievance narrative was treated as an unforgivable sin.
And then Riker uses another famous case to cement this point. The case of James Dimore, the software engineer at Google back in 2017.
The Google memo, that was a massive cultural flashpoint.
It really was everywhere.
Exactly. So Dimore circulated an internal memo attempting to explain why there might be gender disparities in the tech industry, specifically in coding and engineering roles.
Right, and he didn't use bigotry.
No, he cited mainstream, peer-reviewed evolutionary psychology. He suggested that men and women, on average, might possess different biological temperaments.
He specifically cited the big five personality traits, right?
Yes. suggesting men have a higher variance in traits that draw them towards systems and things, while women lean toward people and empathy.
He was essentially arguing that the disparity wasn't purely the result of an evil, sexist patriarchy keeping women out, but rather the result of free choices driven by innate biological differences.
And for the crime of bringing empirical science into the HR echo chamber, Demore was immediately fired.
Just gone.
Rakers emphasizes that Demore wasn't purged because his data was factually wrong. He was purged because his facts blasphemed against the religious doctrine of equity. Reality itself became a fireable offense.
Because this linguistic and cultural framework hasn't just warped debate. Riker argues it has completely warped the modern justice system and destroyed the foundation of the family unit.
Let's examine his critique of modern justice, which he explicitly frames as a gynocentric inquisition.
Gynocentric inquisition.
He draws a direct, chilling historical parallel between modern HR diversity tribunals and the 1793 French Revolutionary Tribunal established during the Reign of Terror.
Oh, the sans-culotte. Maximilien Robespierre, where the mere whisper from a neighbor that you were a traitor to the revolution got you thrown in a cart and sent to the guillotine.
Precisely. The defining mechanic of the French Revolutionary Tribunal was that it explicitly abolished the presumption of innocence and the need for physical evidence.
So you were guilty until proven innocent.
Exactly. Riker claims that modern diversity, equity, and inclusion apparatuses operate using the exact same ideological machinery. The objective classical standard of due process has been entirely replaced by the subjective standard of equity.
He highlights a very specific, highly publicized event as the prototype for this new era of tribunals without charge. He points to the 2006 Duke Lacrosse case.
This is a pivotal foundational moment in his narrative. We really have to look at how that case unfolded.
So in 2006, 3 Duke University lacrosse players, white males from privileged backgrounds, were accused of horrific sexual crimes by an exotic dancer they had hired for a party.
And what happened next is what Riker really focuses on. Before any trial took place, before any evidence was corroborated by police, the media entirely crucified these young men.
It was a rush to judgment.
The mechanics of that rush to judgment was staggering. A rogue prosecutor named Mike Nifong realized the political utility of the case and pushed it forward despite massive glaring holes in the accuser's story.
Right. And the university administration essentially abandoned their own students. They canceled the season and expelled players.
Most damningly, Riker points to the group of 88.
What was that again?
88 Duke faculty members who signed and published a public letter that essentially condemned the students and validated the narrative of systemic racism and sexism long before the facts were known.
The public demanded blood. They demanded it based entirely on the uncorroborated claims of a self-proclaimed marginalized victim against wealthy, white, male athletes.
It perfectly fit the Marxist oppressed matrix.
But the truth eventually emerged. The accused men were completely demonstrably innocent. The timeline didn't work. The accuser changed her story repeatedly.
And crucially, the DNA evidence entirely exonerated them. Evidence that prosecutor Mike Nifong had actively attempted to hide.
Wow. And Nifong was eventually disbarred and jailed for contempt.
But Riker points out the terrifying aftermath. When the truth finally emerged and the boys were declared innocent by the Attorney General, the damage to their lives was already done.
And the institutions, the media, the university, that group of 88, they simply moved on without a single ounce of meaningful apology or institutional introspection.
Riker uses the mechanics of the Duke lacrosse case to prove his thesis. In the modern panopticon, a man is deemed guilty the moment the accusation is made by a protected class.
Innocence is treated merely as an inconvenient technicality that gets in the way of social justice.
You are judged not by the objective metrics of your actions, but by the subjective hysteria of the accuser.
And he warns men about a very specific psychological trap used in these modern HR tribunals. It is an acronym called DARVO. Deny, attack, reverse victim, and offender.
The psychology of DARVO is incredibly insidious. Let's say a man is pulled into HR and accused of a microaggression. If he attempts to defend himself, if he says, no, that is factually not what I meant, here's the context.
Right, if he just tries to explain.
The tribunal uses DARVO against him. They claim his defense is inherently aggressive. They claim his denial is further proof of his unconscious bias and fragility.
Suddenly, the man is labeled the abuser simply for trying to clear his name.
It creates a meta-communicative lock. It's a lose-lose scenario. If you defend yourself, you are aggressive. If you remain silent, your silence is taken as an admission of guilt.
That is terrifying.
Riker argues this is a psychological paralysis designed intentionally to break a man's will and force a confession to a crime he didn't commit.
But Riker doesn't stop at corporate HR or university tribunals.
Yeah.
He takes this exact same framework of destruction and applies it to the collapse of the nuclear family.
Yes.
He argues that this systemic war on patriarchy has triggered a complete societal collapse, creating what he calls a fatherless wasteland.
He brings some incredibly heavy statistical data to bear on this point. Riker points out that approximately 85% of youth currently in prison come from fatherless homes.
85%.
Yes. Children raised without a father in the home are 4 times more likely to live in poverty, 7 times more likely to become pregnant as teenagers, and twice as likely to drop out of high school.
Riker distills this data into a highly controversial, absolute claim. He writes, "Poverty does not cause crime. Fatherlessness causes crime. Poverty is merely a symptom. The missing father is the disease."
He views the traditional nuclear family not as an oppressive patriarchal prison, which is how Marxist feminists often frame it, but as the essential foundational structure that socializes wild boys into productive men.
He argues the state has systematically dismantled this structure, attempting to substitute cold, bureaucratic welfare payments for actual paternal authority, and the result is a generational disaster.
And part of that disaster, according to Riker, is the systematic destruction of male-only spaces. He claims that exclusive male spaces are essential crucibles for society.
Crucibles meant to forge psychological and physical resilience through friction, physical competition, and shared burden.
He argues a very specific mechanic of male bonding here. Men do not typically build deep trust by sitting in a circle and crying about their feelings.
Right.
They build trust by bleeding together on a mat or laboring together on a construction site toward a common, difficult objective.
But the state, acting on the progressive doctrine of equity, demands the removal of all exclusive male spaces.
Why?
Because, as Riker claims, the state understands a fundamental law of power. Men who are isolated from other men are exponentially easier to manipulate, tax, and control.
An isolated man has no tribe to validate his perception of reality against the state's gaslighting narrative.
He points to the Boy Scouts of America going co-ed and changing its name to Scouts BSA in 2019 as a catastrophic capitulation to this dynamic.
He argues they completely diluted the masculine rigor and purpose of the organization to appease a gynocentric mob that hated them anyway, and the result was institutional bankruptcy and a loss of identity.
He draws this incredibly sharp, vivid contrast. He compares a modern university safe space complete with coloring books, emotional support dogs, and Play-Doh, meant to soothe fragile young adults from the trauma of hearing a conservative speaker with a traditional martial arts gym, a dojo.
The martial arts mat is central to his philosophy.
He calls the dojo an arena of pure, unadulterated, objective meritocracy. The mat doesn't care about your pronouns. It doesn't care about your intersectional victim score. On the mat, competence is universally respected, and incompetence is choked unconscious.
It's the ultimate reality check.
It really is a striking visual representation of his entire philosophy. The padded room of the matriarchy versus the iron forge of the patriarchy. But I want to push on this concept of the forge. It's a powerful image, but I wonder, is there any room in Riker's Thomistic classical worldview for actual male vulnerability?
Ah, that's a good question.
Or does he view any deviation from strict stoic endurance as a capitulation to feminization? Like if a man experiences genuine trauma or clinical depression, does Riker's framework just tell him to rub dirt on it and go back to the gym?
It sounds like it might.
Doesn't that risk creating a brittle kind of masculinity that snaps under pressure instead of bending?
If we look closely at his references in the text to Viktor Frankl and the psychological concept of the existential vacuum, we can actually find a surprisingly nuanced answer to your question.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Riker isn't denying that men suffer. In fact, he dedicates considerable space to diagnosing the modern epidemic of male despair and suicide. However, he diagnoses the root cause of that despair entirely differently than a modern therapist would.
How so?
He argues that modern men are deeply depressed, not because they aren't in touch with their feelings, but because they have been entirely stripped of their biological meaning. They have been robbed of their evolutionary utility as protectors, providers, and builders.
So his cure for male depression isn't talk therapy, it's tangible purpose.
Precisely. He would argue that telling a deeply depressed man to sit in a room and endlessly analyze his childhood trauma is a feminine therapeutic model that acts as a corrosive solvent on the male psyche.
Interesting.
The masculine remedy for despair, in his view, is the restoration of honor, the taking on of heavy responsibility and integration into a hierarchy of competent brothers.
So he doesn't deny vulnerability exists. He simply believes it must be managed and overcome through forward action and brotherhood, not wallowed in through institutionalized victimhood.
Exactly.
Okay, that brings us to the climax of the book. After diagnosing this total systemic capture and collapse of Western institutions, what is Riker's prescription? What is the actual call to action for the men reading this?
His command is twofold: absolute linguistic defiance, followed by a strategic, total withdrawal.
Let's start with the linguistic defiance. He tells men to completely anchor their psychological state in objective reality. Never apologize for an unintentional offense.
Never.
If HR hauls you in for a meeting, you do not play the Darvu game. You do not get defensive. Instead, you use what he calls the Thomistic distinguo.
The distinguo. That is a classical medieval debate tactic of making a razor-sharp distinction to expose a logical fallacy in your opponent's argument.
How does that look in practice?
Riker gives a concrete example. When a diversity consultant shrieks about the dangers of toxic masculinity, Riker instructs his readers to look them dead in the eye and say, let us distinguish between masculinity, which is the biologically hard-coded drive to protect, build, and provide, and toxicity, which is the malicious, antisocial behavior of individuals regardless of their gender.
So by slicing the concept in two, you completely reject the premise that your natural biology is a disease. You refuse their gerrymandered definition.
He says, the boy who named the emperor's nakedness did not apologize. He simply pointed at reality and let the truth burn the lie to the ground.
But defiance in the HR office isn't his ultimate solution. The ultimate praxis, the real-world action he demands from his readers, is a mass withdrawal of male competence from the collective state.
It really reminds me of an Atlas Shrugged scenario, but applied to the modern gig economy and corporate world.
That is a very apt analogy. This is where his rhetoric reaches its absolute peak. Riker argues that the masculine neuroarchitecture is designed to calculate the vector of least resistance to impose order upon the void. Men are the builders.
But the modern state demands that men apologize for the original sin of building Western civilization. It demands they apologize for the indoor plumbing, the orbital satellites, and the electrical grid that allowed the state to exist.
So he says, fine, stop building for them. His quote is, the true rebellion of the builder is to let the HR department try to pour the concrete.
Let them pour the concrete.
He calls for competent men to immediately withdraw their heavy lifting, their tax surplus, and their intellectual labor from institutions that actively despise them.
Concrete doesn't care about your pronouns, and gravity does not respect your feelings. That's his line.
It's a heavy line.
He is predicting and actively advocating for the collapse of this soft totalitarianism under the crushing weight of its own physical irrationality. But it is crucial to note he isn't advocating for pure nihilism.
Right. He isn't saying go hide in the woods, eat bugs, and give up. He is calling for men to build parallel economies, decentralized networks, private firearms clubs, martial arts phalanxes, independent entrepreneurial guilds.
He looks deep into history for this model. He specifically points to the monastic preservation of Western civilization during the fall of the Roman Empire.
Like the monks.
Yes. When Rome collapsed in the 5th century under the weight of its own bureaucratic decadence, its obsession with bread and circuses, it wasn't the politicians who saved knowledge.
It was the men of the church.
Operating under strict, patriarchal, fraternal hierarchies in remote monasteries. They preserved the engineering knowledge, copied the classical manuscripts by hand, and defended the intellectual tradition from the invading barbarians.
He wants modern men to be those monks, operating entirely outside the reach of the gynocentric state, using crypto or parallel financial systems, preserving logic, reason, and the trivium until the cultural storm passes.
It is an incredibly powerful, romantic, rhetorical climax for his target audience. It's the ultimate assertion of male agency against a system he views as fundamentally parasitic.
But practically speaking, I have to ask, is a completely parallel economy actually feasible in the modern hyper-connected world? Can you really just opt out of the banking system, the internet infrastructure, the global supply chains?
It's a huge ask.
Or is this monastic withdrawal just a romanticized ideal for guys who are frustrated with corporate DEI seminars? It's one thing for a monk to copy a book on parchment in a stone tower in the 5th century. It's entirely another to build a parallel electrical grid or a semiconductor supply chain today without the state immediately intervening and shutting you down.
That is the ultimate stress test of Riker's entire philosophy. Can the architect actually take his blueprints and leave? In a highly financialized, globally integrated society, the state has unprecedented tools to freeze bank accounts, deplatform businesses from servers, and crush parallel structures.
It seems almost impossible.
Riker's vision requires a level of collective coordination and individual sacrifice that is staggeringly high.
So it might be impossible.
Perhaps. However, he might argue that the increasing fragility of the current system, the supply chain shocks, the rolling power grid failures, the crumbling infrastructure, proves that the withdrawal is already happening.
Not by a coordinated announced strike.
Exactly, but by the quiet quitting of highly competent men who simply refuse to engage with or excel in a system that punishes them. He might argue the parallel economy isn't a utopian project. It's going to become a brutal necessity for survival when the main grid finally fails under the weight of its own incompetence.
That is a chilling but deeply fascinating perspective.
It forces you to look at the cracks in the pavement differently, doesn't it?
It really does. All right, let's pull all of this together. We have been on an intense, deep journey through the architecture of Conrad Riker's worldview. Offense is taken, not given.
It's been quite the ride.
We started with his rigorous defense of objective reality and the physical laws of violence. We walked through his deconstruction of the blank slate and John Money's failed experiments.
We mapped out the long march of the Marxist theorists, the ontological gerrymandering of our dictionary, and the rise of HR tribunals replacing the presumption of innocence.
And finally, we looked at his radical call to action, the complete withdrawal of male competence and the building of parallel monastic-style brotherhoods.
It is a sweeping, aggressive, and highly systematized critique of modernity. And as a reminder to you, our listener, our goal today was to thoroughly map out these highly charged arguments exactly as they are presented in the source, allowing you to see the logical machinery at work beneath the culture war rhetoric.
Which brings us to our final thought. We always like to leave you with something to mull over that builds on the deep dive, but wasn't explicitly spelled out in the text. Expert, what is the final provocative thought for our listeners today?
Let's return to Riker's ultimate solution, the withdrawal of the architects. He advocates for the most competent, logically driven men to completely withdraw their skills and build siloed parallel societies to weather the collapse of the mainstream culture.
Okay.
But this raises an immense, lingering question. If the architects truly take their blueprints and leave, if the most capable minds deliberately isolate themselves in ideological and economic fortresses, does that actually preserve civilization for the future?
Or does it make it worse?
Right. Or does it simply accelerate the fracturing of humanity into entirely separate, mutually incomprehensible realities, virtually guaranteeing the very dark age that Riker is trying to survive? If the builders refuse to maintain the bridges, who are they ultimately punishing? The corrupt bureaucrats or the innocent people driving over the water when the bridge collapses?
Wow. Does withdrawal save the world or just hasten its end? That's a heavy, essential question to carry with you. Something for you to explore on your own.
Indeed it is.
Thank you for diving deep with us today. Just a final reminder, please like and subscribe to the show. It is the best way to support what we do.
Yes, please do.
And if you want to explore this intense source material firsthand, open up your apps and search for Lines. Offense is Taken, Not Given by Conrad Riker on Amazon Kindle and Google Playbooks. And be sure to follow him for more of his unvarnished thoughts on Substack at Conrad and Riker. We will catch you on the next deep dive. Keep questioning everything.